All right, good. So we have about an hour and 40 minutes for this panel, and we called it Black Sea Security Importance for the Littoral States and Beyond. We're going to start with Michael Cecire. I'm going to say a few words about our speakers. I'm going to give them between, I would say about 15 minutes, 15, maximum 20, but that will give us, plenty of time for Q&A. Let me say a few words about Michael. Michael Cecire is a veteran strategic advisor and researcher with extensive experience managing and conducting policy research and developing policy alternatives across foreign policy, national security, and economic policy equities. And he's focused on the South Caucasus and the Black Sea. Currently, he is a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, where he is the political military officer who covers the Caucasus and the Black Sea regions. He's also associated the Institute for the Middle East, Central Asia, and Caucasus Studies. And I could say many, many more things about him and his contributions to the field, but I think I will finish there. After Michael, we're having Yulia. Yulia Sabina Georgia, do I pronounce that correctly? Georgia is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's Black Sea program. She teaches European security as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and George Washington University. Her research and teaching focuses primarily on European and Black Sea security. Prior to this, Yulia served as the advisor to the Romanian president and as a deputy project manager at NATO Allied Command Transformation in Virginia. Again, I could say many more things, but I'm going to stop there. And finally, Asli Aydin Tashbash. Is that okay? Good. Asli is a visiting fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and a senior associate fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She has also been a global opinions columnist at the Washington Post during 2016-23, and prior to joining the foreign policy community in 2016, she had a long career in journalism, during which she focused on Turkey, its domestic evolution, and foreign policy in an age of geopolitical competition. So I want to thank all three speakers for agreeing to come here. Again, I want to thank Mahmuka for largely organizing this, and I also want to thank Lizzie Zaldastani, who has been part of this whole process, who works at the Davis Center and is trying to raise money for us. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Michael. You'll begin, and as I said, about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. First of all, thank you to Harvard University's Georgia program and to GW for hosting us, and of course the Georgian Embassy. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak with you all and to join such an accomplished group at the podium here. I should mention that because I am a bipartisan staff at the Helsinki Commission and as a card-carrying member of the Human Rights Industrial Complex, I think it's important to say a few words on the recently reintroduced foreign agent legislation in Georgia. Just want to point out that given the situation we're talking about here about Black Sea security and the importance of partnership and relationships and the principles that bind the United States and Georgia and some of our other partners and allies in that region, this foreign agent legislation really looks like an attack on those fundamentals, the fundamentals of U.S. and Georgia ties, as well as Georgia's ties with Europe and the Euro-Atlantic space more broadly, that it proceeds against the strong advice of all those it calls friends, I think should be particularly alarming to everybody here, and it's certainly alarming to me. So I think that's important to point out. With regard to the Black Sea as a strategic space and Black Sea security more generally, I think we're thinking about it in a few ways. One is the ways by which Black Sea security is changing in front of us as this war between Russia and Ukraine proceeds. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has prompted a dramatic rethinking and an overdue one, I think, of Black Sea security and what it means for this region to be secure. And that's really the fundamental locomotive behind the Black Sea security strategy in Congress, as well as broader congressional and I would say governmental efforts to form a more comprehensive approach to the Black Sea and security and to ensure some kind of an enduring edifice for a long-term, sustainable and durable security strategy. In particular, I want to note a few things. One is that I think we can look back over the centuries and see that the Black Sea has for a long time been a locus of contestation and even for strategic contagion to varying degrees. That's absolutely the case now. And there are periods of time where it has ebbed and flowed, but given its geography, being the meeting place between transnational organizations like the EU and the CSTO and NATO, but also between historical great powers and a number of other states and ethnic groups. It has been a place where conflict has occurred and has also been a place where conflict is incubated and spreads out radially. And so a real motivating aspect behind the idea of Black Sea security is to try to arrest some of those cycles of conflict and ensure that there is a basis for which cooperation and peacefulness can be brokered and sustained. With regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think what we see is a principal expression of the ways by which this contestation can explode and can become a regional and maybe even a global threat. And so we've seen the ways by which the Russian Federation has used its position in the Black Sea as a way of pressing its own imperial aims in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, but also a broader imperial agenda throughout the region, including into Eastern Europe itself. And so the idea is, if we're going to think about a sustainable security environment and a sustainable Black Sea security, it has to be one that is able to contend with that aggressive posture posed by the Russian Federation and put it in a position where it recognizes that it's not able to prosecute its aggressive claims in the region, and that it instead chooses a path of cooperation instead. I think there's some lessons that we can learn from the arc of the conflict that's played out so far in Ukraine and in the Black Sea. In the Black Sea in particular, we see very clearly that Ukraine has been able to largely independently develop a conventional deterrence posture in the Black Sea environment and the littoral, and also to be able to. It also gives us some clues about how it might be able to posture itself into the future upon the conclusion of this conflict. In particular, I want to note a few things. One, this conventional deterrence posture has been one that Ukraine has been able to create largely due to its own innovative efforts in being able to use asymmetric capabilities and innovation in battlefield technology to make the position of the Black Sea fleet, the Russian Black Sea fleet, essentially untenable. So the discussion, and as Ambassador Zakaliani referred earlier, and Dr. Jones referred earlier, the discussion around the development of a Russian anchorage in Ochamchire and Abkhazia is a really important reminder, not of Russia's powers in the Black Sea, but actually its weaknesses. The fact that it has chosen to develop a new port for its naval assets in occupied Abkhazia is a reflection of the fact that Russia has begun to understand that it does not have the capability to stay out of the harm's way of Ukrainian long-range munitions, and that and even in Novorossiysk, its port there, they remain within the envelope of long-range Russian fires or long-range Ukrainian fires. And so in developing this Abkhazian port, they're trying to diversify their strategy. They're trying to essentially escape from Ukrainian long-range munitions. And so that's, I think, a really good example of how a conventional deterrence posture has been established by and through the force of arms by the Ukrainian government. And it does tell us too about looking into the future, how an eventual peace could be won in the Black Sea more broadly. And that is, and I think that's where we have to think about a security fabric and a security environment, one that isn't merely dependent on specific military systems, but one that has to be go hand in hand with them. In particular, I want to raise a couple of things. One is that this Ukrainian conventional deterrence posture is precisely the thing that Russia was probably most animated and concerned about when it launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. The buildup preceding this 2022 invasion coincided with a period in which Russia was widely regarded internationally and certainly regarded itself as being at the height of its military powers. It had conducted what it saw as being relatively successful adventures in Libya, in Syria, in Georgia, as well as within Ukraine itself in the Donbass, and had really been able to broadcast and amplify this idea that it was a great conventional power, and it had the means and mechanisms in order to impose its will wherever it saw fit. Now, what it also saw, however, playing out in Ukraine was the fact that Ukraine was developing over time its own independent capacity, and in the contest that it was having with Ukraine in the Donbass, it was becoming evident that Ukraine was approaching a point where it would be within a 5 to 10 year envelope able to independently deter Russia in a pretty significant way. And so in engaging in this full-scale invasion, this was a means by which Russia could quote unquote solve the Ukraine problem. But what it ended up doing instead was accelerate this process. And now we have a Ukraine that is as armed to the teeth as it's ever been, and is working very, very hard to push to the front line, push to the field as many long-range systems, as many battlefield capabilities as they can, and engaging in innovation in order to do so. And so that tells us something about what Russia's strategy was and how it's failed and how it continues to be failing. It also tells us about, in a post-conflict environment, the way to a sustainable peace is a couple of things. One is that a Black Sea security strategy requires that there be a durable security complex, one where Russia is unable to prosecute its aims militarily, or it does so only at great or impossible military cost, and on the other hand is only able to achieve whatever kind of political goals that it has through peaceful means, through cooperation, through negotiation, through diplomacy. And the key to that, I think, at least for me personally, and I think for a number of folks that I speak to in the community, the way to that is to ensure that there is a durable security environment that is based on an enforcement architecture, not just a normative architecture, but an enforcement architecture that covers countries like Ukraine, that covers countries like Georgia and Armenia and other Western-oriented countries that seek to have a greater agency over their own foreign policy and wants to be free of external aggression. And that's, I think, a really important thing for us to be thinking about as we develop a Black Sea security strategy. It's not just, for example, this interagency report that is going to be developed in the 2024 as a result of the 2024 NDAA. This interagency report is very important to think about kind of the conceptual aspects of what Black Sea security looks like. But it's all flowing towards a particular goal, and that is the ability for a country like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Moldova, these other countries that have had to subsist in the so-called gray zone, and allow them to be able to integrate or orient as freely as they would like, and without the fear of being invaded by an aggressive power. I'm going to stop there because I know there's a lot more, much more smart people to weigh in on this topic, but I'm happy to go into this further in the Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Yes. Okay, good. Well, thank you, Michael. A very interesting overview, really good place to start and think about the concrete nature of security, what it means for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, among others. So thank you very much. You kept well within time. So now I'm going to hand it over to Julia. And yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
Is the microphone working in the back?
Have you got it on your lapel?
Yeah. All right, maybe closer, better. All right, thank you. Thank you to the organizers for putting this very timely and important conference event together. Special thanks for Mamuka, who's been organizing everything behind the doors. And also a shout out, if you see that it's so popular, it's because I have convinced my students who I'm teaching at this time downstairs to come upstairs to learn about Black Sea security. So thanks to them for being here, and a shout out to both Allison and Gianna, who used to be my fellows with the State Department grant that I run with the Black Sea program, and are now working at the Davis Center and are in the audience. And so it's great to bring back the community, and of course great to be with Michael particularly, who's also working with me, or working together at the Institute at Georgetown University and towards Black Sea security. I promised to talk less so about the Black Sea strategy. I think Michael has done already a fantastic job, and there's little for me to add. But to talk a little bit about Romania's and Bulgaria's perspectives onto the region. They're two medium to small countries, but they weigh increasingly heavily in a security environment in which they benefit from NATO and EU membership, maybe more important now than any time before, but are both, I think, reflecting off the challenges that we're seeing in the region and that we're looking at in the months and years to come. So I'll make 3 points in this context. The first one will be about how we got to the security environment that we are in from the perspective of Romania and Bulgaria, looking at the Black Sea region, where we are at in terms of security and cooperation and challenges relevant from their perspectives, but looking also onto the region and relevant for the entire region, and also where we're going, because I think we are, and I think many agree that we are at a turning point, and that from now on, things can look very different from the last 2 years. It's obvious to say, but I have to frame that anyway, that the war has radically shifted the security environment in the region, and not just the arrangements, also the perceptions. And Bulgaria, in this case, I'll get to that in a second, is a great example of that. The war has essentially reconfirmed, in the case of Romania, its worst security fears. And it has determined Bulgaria to shift its security orientation somewhere between 90 to 180 degrees, depending on who you're talking to politically in Sofia. It has certainly enhanced security cooperation across the spectrum for Bulgaria, for Romania, for Ukraine, for Moldova in between, and also for Turkey. We'll hear about that later on from our colleague. And so that's an important aspect of it. But the way the war has been going over the last 2 years, and particularly over the last few months, it's clear that we are not doing enough. And that it's the actions that we're taking, whether we're looking at the countries in the region or essential partners such as the United States, first and foremost, but also the European Union and others are insufficient. I'm just replicating here or repeating something that others have said before me. I think yesterday was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway was making the point we're all not doing enough, and we're seeing the results of that. To look at where, how we got to where we are, I think to me, a valid example of how urgent, how stringent, and how big the problem is visible here in town. Last week, as I was walking to this building, there were everywhere flags of Japan. Japan's prime minister was visiting Japan, one of the most important strategic alliances that the United States benefits from. And the prime minister came to Congress to tell Americans, to urge Americans in Congress on both sides of the aisle to help Ukraine. I don't think we've ever seen that before. It's the 21st century, and Japan, from the other end of the world, is urging the United States to approve supplemental aid because the situation is so dramatic for Ukraine and the implications are so ample, including for Japan, that we are in the situation now. Just a week ago, on the other side of the Elliott School at the White House. If we're looking at Europe, as I'm zooming in, Europeans, we see a lot on one side of the aisle here that arguments that Europeans have not been doing enough. I can definitely argue that Europeans have been slow to move and that there's always more space to do more. But if we're looking at the numbers, at this point, Europeans have been contributing double the amount that the United States has for a war that is essential primarily for European security, and so it's only right to do so. But it is important to be aware of these numbers. And if we're looking at the countries in the region, including Romania and Bulgaria, we also know that at NATO and EU level, we have all underinvested in territorial defense, and we've all focused, including under the leadership of the United States, on other types of security and defense. And now we have a lot to catch up with, has been visible over the last few months. The premise, however, that we're starting with as we're looking at the region is that the Black Sea security can only be achieved by pushing Russia out of Ukraine and by ending this war, so that we lay the premises for a stable and democratic and free future for not just Ukraine, but for the entire region. And if I am to compare how countries have been adjusting over the last 2 years, I have to analyze it starting with some turning points. And I think the most important one in terms of perceptions has been 2014, Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. And ever since, we've seen Ukraine and Romania trying to catch up, trying to adapt and to rearm as much as has been possible, but of course it's never enough. And for countries like Bulgaria and like Moldova, this has been a wake-up call, not necessarily as much of a catch-up, but rather a wake-up call, and much later than for others, particularly as we're looking at 2022. And to be able to analyze where we are at in this moment, we have to look at the mistakes that we've all collectively made to realize how we can fix them in the future. And if we're looking at these mistakes, we're looking all the way back, and we have to realize that we are now paying for the mistakes that have been adding up in terms of costs over the past couple of decades, to say the least. Probably we have to start with the Budapest Memorandum and the mistakes that were made then that would have, if it would have been a different outcome, would have prevented this war altogether. The withdrawal of thousands of American nuclear weapons from European grounds to the point that we are at 100 or 200, and in a situation in which NATO is constantly being blackmailed from the Russian side. The lack of a strategic assessment at the level of NATO altogether after 2008 and Russia's invasion of Georgia, and the lack of response that we've seen altogether from NATO's side. In 2010, we had NATO's strategic concept, NATO security strategy, in which we called collectively Russia a partner, not a challenge, not a threat, even though in 2008, we had Russia's invasion of Georgia. And then we're looking at 2014 and NATO's adaptation to Russia's aggression that has been slow and insufficient, particularly as we're looking at the Black Sea region and the fact that we haven't had even military tripwires in the region, unlike in the Baltic Sea region. And then we're looking into how countries have been reacting and adjusting ever since. And that's what I was meaning. I meant when I said that Bulgaria has been turning significantly 90 to 180 degrees. In 2016, it was Romania that was putting forward an initiative at NATO level for a NATO Black Sea fleet. Wouldn't it have been nice to have that in 2022? And how much would that have been? How much aggression would have been prevented in this instance? But back then, we had Bulgaria vetoing that, changing its position 180 degrees due to most likely Russian pressure. And so now we're looking at a situation after 2014 with Russia's militarization of Crimea after the illegal annexation, in which Russia has been constantly attempting, but particularly amplifying after 2014, attempting to transform the Black Sea into a Russian lake. And we're seeing the costs that countries, Ukraine primarily, but others are bearing due to that. And if we're looking at where we are now, Michael was referring to that a little bit earlier, but I think it's important to mention the fact that Ukraine, with some important aid from the West, but also with the innovation and with the drive that it has been working towards within the country, and when it comes to its defense policy, it has enabled somewhat of a freedom of navigation in the western side of the Black Sea due to the weapons and the military tactics that it has employed. It has been benefiting also very much from Bulgarian and Romanian aid. So if we're looking at particularly the grain deal that we've all been focusing on and the consequences on food security globally, Russia has canceled it last summer. But that has enabled Ukraine then to create a grain corridor, I think we call it the second time, which is hugging the territorial waters in cooperation with Romania and Bulgaria, the territorial waters of these two countries, to be able to export grain through the Black Sea, including with the support of, at least partial support of Turkey. And so that brings us then to the full side of the full part of the glass, even though maybe it's not half full, but only to a significant extent, because we have to also acknowledge the unprecedented levels of cooperation that we're seeing when it comes to security in the region, particularly in the western side of the Black Sea in the context of NATO and the European Union. But not only. If we're looking at Ukraine, primarily it's about enhanced readiness. If we're looking at Romania, we have a long list of now 2.5% of GDP dedicated to military acquisitions, heavy militarization programs to be able to again catch up. A lot of help when it comes to security, when it comes to energy, when it comes to transportation, given to Ukraine, given to Moldova, and a lot of cooperation with Bulgaria as well. In looking into Bulgaria, a radical turn, also an increase in the military budget, also an increase in military acquisition significantly to a pace that I am pretty pleased with. A significant change in public opinion. Somewhat recently, I was hosting a Bulgarian ambassador to the United States in a roundtable, and he was mentioning how at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the population was indeed, according to the poll, split, with 40-something% blaming NATO for the full-scale invasion of Russia, and how the Bulgarian government, the ambassador is the former defense minister of Bulgaria during the full-scale invasion, how his government has been managing to change the numbers to up to 20% in terms of public opinion, and to shift the perception of the blame away, of course, from absurd blaming NATO. And I've asked him how he did that, and he said, by starting to talk accurately about history. Very interesting, and also part of how we should be thinking about lessons learned in the region and how we can reduce the costs for the mistakes that we previously made. And if we're looking at cooperation, I'll mention here another thing that goes under the radar as one of many examples, but has been inspiring to say the least. Romania and Bulgaria, both NATO and EU countries, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, a few months into it, closing or agreeing on the most comprehensive strategic partnership I have ever seen in the region. It cannot be compared to Romania, United States, or Bulgaria, United States. That's completely different. But at the regional level, with the priorities of helping Moldova and helping Ukraine integrate into the European Union, and in the case of Ukraine into NATO, prioritizing these elements. And then it goes without saying that when it comes to cooperation, security cooperation, we have in Romania a very significant cooperation with the United States, maybe the most important strategic partnership there. At this point, Romania is hosting United States American troops on 2 major military bases, plus 5 additional smaller and training bases. Romania and Bulgaria both are hosting NATO battle groups as part of the adjustments and adaptation that NATO has been going through in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. And both are working significantly towards increasing the level of infrastructure, critical infrastructure that we need in order to make security cooperation more efficient and deterrence more efficient. And so, and then last but not least, in terms of cooperation, and that bridges a little bit to what we will hear in a minute on Turkey as well, the first ever initiative in the Black Sea region that is regional and that excludes Russia, and that is formed by Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey towards minesweeping to be able to mitigate some of the risks that we have been dealing with, and insecurity and costs that we have been dealing with in the western part of the Black Sea. So that leads me to my last very brief point, where we are heading. That, of course, is not as positive of a picture as I've just been painting with the regional cooperation. Russia has certainly brought countries together when it comes to cooperation, something that we haven't seen as much before 2022. But on the other hand, we have reached a tipping point in the war that has enormous implications for the region and beyond. We're dealing with across the board insufficient aid for Ukraine. That's something that you already know. We're talking at this point already, some of the NATO member states, about sending troops instead of sending military aid. That again should tell us how our strategy in mitigating the effects and preventing the war from prolonging and widening have failed. And we're looking at increasing costs, because we already know that the longer we wait, the more costs will add up. And so if we're looking at potential scenarios, I cannot really add to something that I've written about at the beginning of this year in January, that we are looking this year at the risk of the front line significantly moving, that we're looking at a scenario in which we could have a new border between NATO and Russia if the front lines are collapsing in Ukraine towards the end of the year or into the next year. Then we're looking at Moldova being most likely overrun. It's not about invading. I don't think Russia needs to do that because Moldova already is inherently weak and depends on the security that Ukraine and Romania are providing. We're looking at the level of Europe, of the European Union and NATO territory at many more millions of refugees that we're already seeing. And I don't think we've calculated the costs that we would be bearing socially, economically, etc., with this scenario. And of course, with the war, we're also looking at an increasing involvement of Iran. Iran is now directly threatening NATO territory, including with Iranian-made drones that are falling now repeatedly on NATO territory. So this is also widening of the war and including of more actors. Initially it was Belarus, now we're looking at Iran. And so with that and with the knowledge that this war in terms of capabilities and know-how and tactics could have already been finished a while ago, and so the costs would have been significantly lower. The scenarios as we're looking ahead into the next few months and into 2025, unfortunately, are very grim and are going back to the initial thesis that we all have to be doing more to be able to reduce the costs primarily for Ukraine, but also significantly the cost that we are bearing across the alliance and across the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Rather grim ending there to your analysis. If Western powers and NATO do up their game, then hopefully that sort of scenario will be mitigated in some way. But I want to thank Julia for highlighting the western part of the Black Sea, namely Bulgaria and Romania, which often we neglect. And clearly the grain corridor has highlighted their role, as has indeed the Russian missiles flying over Romanian airspace. Clearly these two countries are absolutely integral to any effective Black Sea strategy and security, something that Michael also talked about. So thanks for highlighting that. Now we're going to go to the other power. Historically, both Russia and Turkey Turkey in its Ottoman clothes has competed for influence and power in the Black Sea. Russia and Turkey today have a very interesting relationship, a relationship that is I wouldn't call it friendly, but at least there is some degree of cooperation between the two powers. Yet at the same time, they have conflicting interests in the Black Sea that is becoming more and more apparent. So when we're talking about the Black Sea NATO fleet, which would of course be an important thing to have, Turkey, I'm sure, would have a word to say about that. Turkey, of course, controls the straits and supervises the Montreux Convention that controls the entrance of military firepower into the Black Sea. So it's an extremely important power in terms of its influence on what happens there. So I'm going to turn it over now to Asli, who's going to talk about Turkey and its role in the Black Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yes? Okay. Yeah, I think it's working.
Can everybody hear?
Can you hear? Okay, perfect. So I have the tough job of talking about Turkey and the Black Sea, which is, to use a relationship term, it's complicated. Let me first very quickly talk a little bit about Turkish outlook on what's happening in the world right now and its relations with Russia, and then go into the Black Sea element of it. I think when Turkey looks at the world with two wars in its neighborhood, it does see great power competition, but more or less a Hobbesian world, a Middle Ages of sorts, a modern day version of Middle Ages, where its calculus, its understanding of this is in order to survive, it needs autonomy, autonomous foreign policy, and it needs to be able to do this balancing act between the West and the others, the West and the global South, the West and Russia, the West and, if necessary, down the road, China. So that is a very clear understanding of its historic role right now at this moment of a quest for strategic autonomy and a regional influence. And the relationship with Russia, the complicated relationship with Russia, fits in that framework of you have said they're not enemies exactly, but people have called Turkey and Turkish-Russian relation, Turkey and Russia frenemy. We've called it competitive cooperation, cooperative competition, whatever you want to say. At the end of the day, it's a strange bird, something that we're not accustomed to. It's not a relationship that Westerners have an easy understanding of, because we either have allies or we have enemies. But Turkey and Russia, I think, the Turkey feels that it needs to manage the relationship with Russia in the only way it knows how to manage that. Russia is not only its an assertive and imperialist Russia is not only its northern neighbor, but it's also its southern neighbor. And I think that this competitive cooperation does not mean just sort of like managing as in trying to be friends with the other great power, but it has led to Turkish-Russian competition and proxy wars in Libya, in Syria. Even you could make the case that Caucasus and Black Sea, of course, are arenas of competition. But there's also growing trade. Turkey's not going with the Western sanctions. There's also this balancing act that Turkey is doing when it comes to the war in Ukraine, which a friend has characterized as Turkey's policy on the war in Ukraine being pro-Ukrainian without being anti-Russian. And again, if you could have something like that, that's what Turkey is trying to do. Selling, engaging in a defense industrial relationship, selling weapons and drones and so on and so forth to Ukraine, building Ukrainian Navy vessels and, establishing joint defense industrial capabilities, but at the same time, doubling tripling, in fact, its trade with Russia, continuing to buy, continuing its economic engagement and being very cautious. And the Black Sea is one of the areas where this caution comes. I think it's historically been an arena of contestation, the Black Sea, between Turkey and Russia, between Ottoman Empire and Russian empires. The weight of history here is quite overwhelming and not to be overlooked, in the sense that Turkey and Russia have fought 12 major wars, not just battles, wars. Many of them, with the exception of one, Crimean War, were settled in favor of Russia, leading to enormous loss of territory since Peter the Great. So Russia's southward push in Crimea, Ukraine, the Caucasus, quest for influence in the Balkans has always been a problem for Turkey. But I think that there is, given the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine and given Turkey's own difficult relationship with some of its NATO partners, it has chosen to try to focus on escalation management in the Black Sea, establishing military balance in a way that prevents escalation with Russia, between Russia and NATO partners, between Russia and Turkey, but between Russia and NATO partners, and in a way that secures its own interest. I think Turkey has leaned instability with Russia in the Black Sea, more to the disappointment of its NATO partners. That's very clear. There has been a desire for greater NATO access and engagement in the Black Sea. Michael has talked about NATO security strategy, Black Sea security, and so on. And every forum that I go to, people want more NATO, more and more in the Black Sea. But I think that having engaged recently in a proxy war with Russia in Syria and in Libya, and vying for competition, fighting for influence in Russia with the Caucasus, I think Turkey is more cautious in the Black Sea space. This is also, let's not forget that Turkey also operates within the confines of its own military balance of power with Russia, which is, the fact is that by 2011, Russia had surpassed Turkish naval force in the Black Sea. And after the occupation of Crimea and Russia's new military bases in the area, it had become the dominant military power in the Black Sea. It is now changing a little bit with Ukrainian attacks in the Black Sea and Ukraine's really brave efforts actually of pushing back against Russia in the naval space. But the reality hasn't exactly changed at this moment. I think that much of the Turkish-Russian relationship is written off as sort of an Erdogan phenomenon and Erdogan-Putin bromance and so on and so forth. You will see this a lot, but I do think at this moment in history, there seems to be popular support for the idea of balancing act among great powers. And if it were a different government or post-Erdogan government, I do think you would still have a Turkish policy of a balancing act and trying to prevent escalation in the Black Sea space. Very similar to Turkish policy during World War II, when again, staying out of the competition among great powers was the ultimate goal throughout the war. I think maybe on the flip side, Turkey has been supportive of Ukraine and does want Ukraine to succeed and retain its Black Sea coast. Without Ukraine, Turkey cannot balance against Russia in the Black Sea. That is very clear, and I think it's very clear to Turkish decision makers. So the importance of a free, sovereign, and independent Ukraine with a Black Sea coast is fundamental to Turkey's long-term security interests. One of the ways that Turkey, I've talked about defense industrial cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine, but another way that Turkey has been working around this issue is, of course, upholding the Montreal Convention of 1936, which gives Turkey jurisdiction over the Turkish Strait, but also guarantees free passage. And I think Turkey has, as you know, Turkey has limited, has been guaranteeing safe passage, but has used the wartime clause of Montreux to restrict access into the Black Sea of Russian warships. It did not make a huge, it wasn't a game changer, but it was important in terms of Ukraine's ability to take on Russia's military might in the Black Sea, and of course preventing Russia from resupplying its navy there. Perhaps, another issue when it comes to Black Sea is managing expectations from NATO partners. I know there's a lot of frustration on that front. And a Ukrainian friend has defined Turkey's policy in the region as what Turkey seems to want in the Black Sea is to have NATO out, Russia down, regional countries in and Turkey's influence up. And I think this is the reality. This is a way of putting it. But within the confines of that policy, there is room for regional cooperation, as we're seeing between Ukraine and Turkey right now in building navy and other and drones and so on, but also between Turkey and other littoral states. And here I'm referring to Turkish recent cooperation between Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania on sea mines, and that can be the precursor to other greater levels of cooperation when it comes to securing freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, particularly on the western side of the Black Sea. But when it comes to NATO and greater NATO cooperation and sort of Turkey enabling a sort of a more active NATO presence in the Black Sea, I think people are going to be disappointed, because as long as the war continues at the level that it does, with the sort of military trajectory that my colleague Yulia has talked about, I think Turkey will continue to be cautious in that sense. I'm happy to talk about maybe other questions on Turkey and Ukraine and Turkey and Black Sea in the Q&A. I think Turkish officials believe that they have done enough for Ukraine by using Montreux, which is seen as a founding document and the key to securing peace with Russia, by upholding Montreux, but also using it in a way that prevents Russian access across the straits. The rest of it, I mean, that I think Julia and the ambassador has talked about, others have talked about a broader Black Sea focus, the idea of a Black Sea as a region that can have economic, political, and in the future military strategy is something that does appeal to Turkish decision makers. It has appealed to Turkey since the 1990s, but it seems to be so elusive at the moment and not so grounded in reality. So instead of that, instead of a big Black Sea idea at the moment, I think bilateral cooperation and regional cooperation has been the what Turkey has chosen to do in the Black Sea space. That's maybe I'm ending here.
Ashley, thank you very much. It's very important, obviously, to understand Turkey's role. It is, as you say, a NATO member. At the same time, it has relatively positive relations with Russia in some aspects. And of course, it's in many ways dependent on its gas and energy from Russia, which creates some vulnerability for Turkey. Yet at the same time, its regional role is expanding, particularly in the South Caucasus. It's becoming a much more important power in the Black Sea. And I'm sure that's alarming Russia too. So I think all these, I really want to thank everybody. It's been very interesting listening to you all. You're raising questions about the nature of the Black Sea region. And, periodically we see these imperial clashes in the Black Sea, but historically it has been a region of cooperation. Black Sea trade has been always very important to Europe. And now we see, of course, or at least it's been re-emphasized, that the Black Sea clearly is not something marginal to the Mediterranean or the North Atlantic. It's really very much integral to the security of countries to the west of the Black Sea as well, including the United States. So I think we have. So it's 2:53, so we have a little bit around 35 minutes or so for Q&A. Again, thank you to the speakers, and I'm going to open it to the floor. I may gather a couple of questions and then hand it over to the speakers. So please tell me your name when you raise your hand, and Is there a microphone? There's a microphone there. So please, yes, you could tell me your name and position.
Can you hear me? Check.
It's on.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, thank you for that very stimulating discussion. I would like to ask a question about how you perceive the balance that is present now with the fact that the Baltic Sea has Finland and Sweden, and it is basically a NATO lake. And many of those ports used to be Russian. And then how Russia now perceives its Black Sea footprint in having its ports potentially swept up and unavailable. What's it going to do?
Hopes it's going to win the war, I guess. Yeah, any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. My name is Levan Gurganidze. I'm visiting a scholar at GW, Elliott School. My question is, what should Georgia do to aid United States efforts to ensure the security of the Black Sea region?
Okay, we'll start with those two questions and then we'll come to some others. All right, would anybody, so the first question was about the impact of the exclusion of Russia from the Baltic and its, as Michael pointed out, the reflection of its own weakness in the Black Sea. What impact that would have on Russian strategy in the Black Sea? Michael, why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think one thing Russia could do very proactively to ensure it has a more favorable access to its ports is to stop invading its neighbors. I think that's had a clearly deleterious effect on its ability to trade internationally, particularly with the Euro-Atlantic space. I think it's also an interesting question in framing how we think about Black Sea security right now, and I'd like to maybe say something about the way by which we saw Russia's security strategy and posture preceding the full-scale invasion in 2022. And I think most of the people in this room are probably familiar with the anti-Axis aerial denial bubble idea, this notion that Russia had such a density of air defense and weaponry and power projection capabilities in the Black Sea, particularly this idea of Crimea as being a kind of unsinkable aircraft carrier. And it had become so conventional to the point that it was axiomatic, not just here in Washington, but I would say throughout the Euro-Atlantic space, where if you talk about contesting Russia or being a little bit more firm with Russian imperial overtures, let's say, that it immediately brought to mind this idea, well, we have to be very careful because of Russia's capacity for destruction. Obviously, Russia does have great capacity for destruction, but I think it was actually the Turks who really led the way in I think an appreciable respect to say that Russian capabilities were not quite so impressive as they appeared to be. And it was pointed out by my colleague here that Turkey and Russia engaged in proxy conflicts in Libya and Syria, and actually in both those conflicts, Turkey came out very appreciably on top. And then we're seeing here in Ukraine that the Ukrainian military, even without the benefit of having a large capacity of naval assets, has been able to dramatically attenuate Russian naval capabilities in the Black Sea, and has forced Russia to withdraw to far-flung ports and pull out in a large way from Sevastopol and other anchorages in Crimea. So, I think the clearest route for Russia to be able to have good and secure access to its port is to stop attacking its neighbors. I didn't mean that as a light thing. I think that's actually quite clear by the shape of the way this war has gone, where at one point we saw the Montreux Convention and the closure of the straits as being protective of Ukraine. I think there's certainly an argument to be made that the closure of the straits actually has done something of a disservice to Ukrainian targeters who are ready for more Russian ships to transit and target. So I think there's something to be said for that. I don't know if you want me to go to the next question, or I should. Okay.
If Julia, Ashley, if you have any response to that question.
Sure, just to add a little bit, I very much subscribe to Michael's thesis that it should stop invading, and that will solve a lot of problems.
Controversial, I know.
Yeah, but I think there's a little bit more to be added in terms of, from a Russian perspective, how they're thinking about this space. We're separating artificially the regions. This is one of my favorite examples. In the State Department, we have 5 deputy secretaries for the region. Russia looks for the Black Sea region. Russia looks at this as what they call the Arc of Steel that goes all the way from the Arctic to the Gulf. And if we're looking at the Baltic Sea, one might think on paper that NATO is in a far better situation than Russia. But I don't think so. I think we're making significant progress, and certainly Russia has pushed Finland and Sweden after centuries, in the case of Sweden, of neutrality, to join NATO. But if we're looking at Russia not being stopped in Ukraine, the most likely scenario is for them to go for a Baltic country in the Baltic Sea region, where we continue, despite having strong deterrence from NATO, to have significant vulnerabilities. As we're speaking, Russia is for months now jamming GPS in the Baltic Sea region so that we have navigation problems, both in terms of ships as well as aircraft. And so I want to just add here that a little bit of caution, that it's true that we have overestimated Russian potential for destruction, though it is mighty, but that from a Russian perspective, they're not done with the Baltic Sea region, and neither are they anywhere close to being done with the Black Sea region. What we know historically, whether we're looking at the 20th century or all the way back, my Turkish colleague mentioned the 14 wars between the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey and Russia. Romania counts 16 times Russia tried to invade Romania. And the experience that is being historically kind of replicated is that countries like Romania, smaller even, or Ukraine, have the ability to push Russia back if they're ready enough militarily, and if they're using enough deterrence against someone who has for centuries now, independent of whether it's the Federation, the Union, the Soviet Union, or the Russian Empire, been acting like a bully, including when it comes to its ports, access to its ports, and access of other countries to its ports, whether in the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea region. So based on these historical experiences, and with a little bit of caution, we have to, I think, understand better where Russia is at. And though we thought in March or April, some of the most read articles in the United States have been about how Russia has been defeated. This is clearly a failed, our failed assessment. So we have to be, I think, careful in terms of not just the fact that Russia is not done with any of the regions, but that in order for us to decrease our costs, we have to increase our deterrence to discourage Russia for going for where it feels there is weakness, including in regions such as the Baltic Sea that feel a lot more secure and more interoperable than anything that we see in the Black Sea region.
Thank you. And Ashley, would you like to?
Very quickly, the Baltics, I think, is not, well, people talk about the vulnerabilities and escalation in the Baltics, which I never understand because it is firmly NATO territory, whereas the Black Sea is still extremely, I think, vulnerable. And this is where we need to be worried about when we think about escalation and Russian attacks, particularly on civilian traffic there, which is why it's important to try to create some type of maritime stability in the western part of Black Sea, where there is a fair amount of trade still going on, laying out the rules, and there have been various efforts, even involving Russians, to lay the groundwork for some type of civilian maritime rules. So I do worry about Black Sea in that sense more than the Baltics.
Thank you, Asli. So the second question concerns Georgia, because Georgians are equally fearful, perhaps, as the smaller Baltic states are, that should Russia succeed in any way, not necessarily by the entire occupation of Ukraine, but in any way, should it succeed through some form of negotiation, that this will only encourage Russia to make further steps in its aspiring empire. And Georgia would be one of the vulnerable possible states in that scenario. So what about Georgia? What can Georgia do to increase its security, and what role could the US play in that? Michael.
I think there's a few things that Georgia could do to increase its security in relationship with the United States. I think one thing that's very clear is I think we need to be able to have an understanding at the political, at the strategic level, that we're rowing in the same direction. And I think the occasion of Russia's horrific war against Ukraine has has allowed for the possibility of rethinking of the membership of the European Union and potentially even of NATO down the line. I think that we've seen much more movement among traditionally conservative members of both organizations, increasingly open to enlargement, increasingly open to bringing Georgia into one or both of these organizations. And that doesn't mean that there's consensus entirely, but we do see evidence of interest on both counts. And certainly Georgia's awarding of candidate status, I think, is as notable and as impressive an expression of that changing perspective as can be seen, as can be felt. So I think being able to take advantage of that revised political landscape is extremely important. I don't feel that the current government has really done that, and I think in many respects they've gone in the other direction. The other aspect of this too, and I think this is particularly salient here in Washington, is that the U.S., our interest in Georgia is very much dependent on this idea that we have shared values, that we have common principles, and we are thinking about the world in a mutually comprehensible way. And so much of our efforts there in nurturing civil society and providing direct and indirect support to Georgian state building and economic development, so much of that is an expression of this idea that we are working together towards common values, towards a common idea, conception of a liberal democracy. And something I like to say is that Georgia doesn't really have great deposits of hydrocarbons. It doesn't have a first-rate military. It's not a huge and populous country all on its own. But what it does have is it has had this terrific power of attraction, of soft power, in being able to really make Americans feel as though we all are working towards a common enterprise. And I think the degradation of that feeling over the past few years has been both extremely regrettable and is undermining this idea that we can support each other over the long term. There isn't this rule in Washington that Georgia has to be supported and this relationship has to be maintained invariably, indefinitely, in the way that maybe it has been in the past. And I think right now, this moment that we feel and that we see in this acrimony that is broken out between Tbilisi and its partners in Brussels and Washington has been because there's this feeling that our values are not entirely the same, or at least are splitting apart in certain respects. And I think if there is a way that Georgia and the US can get back on the same page, it's really, again, about re-emphasizing those shared values and working together in a common pursuit of them.
Michael, thanks very much. I'm going to skip, if you don't mind, Julian Ashley, on that second question, because I'm sure there are other questions out there and we haven't got that much time. So any other questions? Let me at the back. Yep, please.
Dr. Georgia mentioned earlier about this initiative that existed between Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey to create a NATO working group in the Black Sea. And this is something that the Romanians have tried to put on the agenda of NATO ever since they joined NATO in 2004, 2006. I know President Băsescu made a big deal about the security in the region. And yet the Romanians have not been able to rearm or modernize their navy. The Bulgarians have neither. And I'm wondering, what does it take at this moment when you have a war on your doorsteps, when you have Russia taking over the largest naval base in the Black Sea? What does it take, for example, for Turkey to join into a common NATO policy in the Black Sea that it's actually has an impact on the ground? We know now there's a new, the largest NATO base will be the Black Sea in Romania, but that's not enough because the forward capability of those countries doesn't exist. I mean, you have Soviet, ships that are still battling their outdated technology. So what's the solution there?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
So my name is Luca Guarzoni and I'm a student here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And my question is, what are the motives behind Turkey decisions to build the Istanbul Canal and how its construction could change the dynamics in the Black Sea?
Oh,
Thank you.
good question. Okay, so we've got two very good questions. What's holding Romania and Bulgaria back in terms of, despite their increased spending on defense, what else can they do to become an integral part, let's say, of NATO and its security in the Black Sea? And the second question regarding this new canal that Turkey has completed, I believe, or is not completed yet? No. Yeah.
It's not right now. The plans are off. Largely, shall I?
So
Go ahead.
maybe let's turn to the Bulgarian Romania and then we'll come to the Black Sea Canal. Okay,
Happy to defer. Okay.
carry on.
We'll do it in order. Thank you for the question. And I'm afraid you know that I do not have the complete answer, because if I would, I'd probably be president or a multi-billionaire. But I think it comes down to the fact, to my initial remark, that we're all not doing enough, and that our threat perceptions, though they vary, as you know, between Romania and Bulgaria and Turkey, radically, and Romania has incurred costs because of that, previous to the full-scale invasion, that even at the level of Romania, we're not doing enough. None of us are. And Romanians do not like that, and neither do Bulgarians, but I'll say it anyway. We have to point, I have to point here to those countries that are doing more and say we should be reaching that level, and that should be based on the threat perception that we have, that Russian aggression is not going anywhere, and that we have historical experiences. And so the one example is Poland. Poland is now at, last year they were cooking the numbers to show that they're spending less on defense than they're actually spending on defense, and they're proposing for NATO to raise the standard from 2% to at least 2.5, if not 3%. And so this is a good way to get started, increase defense acquisitions. Both Romania and Bulgaria officials, when they're coming here, they're complaining that the waiting list for Patriots or HIMARS is about 10 years now. So that's then a nod to the defense industry here, as well as in Western Europe, that we need to be picking up production, and that should be not just for NATO within, but obviously also forward defense in terms of aiding Ukraine, because the more we aid Ukraine, the more we decrease the chances that the war is getting closer to the border and that we're incurring further costs. So I'm afraid there's nothing genius about my response, but always doing more is a good idea, and thinking about defense at home long term and forward defense in the form of helping Ukraine for very pragmatic reasons.
Really, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Ashley, who's going to tell us about this Grand Canal project and its current status and what possibly its purpose could be.
Yeah, I mean, let me also talk about this question on Bulgaria, which was essentially on Bulgaria and Romania, but just to add that I think, Turkey seems to be open to these regional initiatives, does not want a big NATO label in it, as I tried to make clear, but already spending 2.5%, I think, of GDP on security, and has a navy that's is strengthening its naval capabilities, but is not there and sort of doesn't have parity with Russia yet. Canal Istanbul has been a very controversial domestic issue in Turkey. This is President Erdogan's dream project, his brainchild, and he has come up with the idea of having a waterway, a straight canal that is parallel to the Bosphorus. It is financially and environmentally, it is a disastrous idea, potentially disastrous. If you just look at it on a commercial level, ships can go and you can just, charge them and set the price, and you're not bound by Montreux and freedom of navigation issues. But because of the salination, the different salt levels in the Black Sea, the Marmara Sea, and the Mediterranean region, and because the areas that are thought of as potential, route for the canal is essentially very sort of important for water systems and irrigation systems for Istanbul. I think there's been a huge controversy about it from environmentalists, from the opposition. Financially, it's something that would bankrupt Turkey unless the Chinese come in and pay for it, which is obviously comes with its own problems. And finally, I think people are nervous about Turkey doing something that tempers with Montreux, which has been the key to stability in the Black Sea since 1936, almost a century. So I think that is now off the table, largely for financial reasons and because of the big opposition.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Yes, and so you first, please.
Hello, my name is Mark Episkopoulos. I'm the Eurasia Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute. Thank you all for what has been a fascinating discussion. I wanted to ask about another security issue in the Black Sea region, and that is Transnistria, the status of Transnistria. There has been a concern that if the Russians prove decisively successful in this war, and that if the Ukrainian front lines were to collapse, the Russians could march through Mykolaiv on Odessa and then proceed to establish a corridor to the garrison in Transnistria, the Russian occupied part of Moldova. And there have been proposals, as I understand it, that the Ukrainians have expressed some interest in these proposals for a joint Moldova-Ukraine military force to enter Transnistria and reestablish Moldovan control over the region. So I was wondering how you would assess these proposals, how you would weigh the risks and benefits, and I mean, do you think that this plan is sensible and beneficial? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Maggie Asdabi-Katz, and recently I spent 5 years at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I was curious about the discussions about regional cooperation, particularly as we all noted, OSCE was not mentioned as an important actor in this discussion, despite not only having all the Black Sea countries as participating states, but also the secondary beneficiaries, as the ambassador mentioned in his opening remarks, Central Asia and also Western Europe. And so just curious, I'm not going to ask what should the role of the OSCE be, but given that this platform was created to provide not only support economic and environmental cooperation, but also political, military cooperation and prevention of conflict, what are the lessons learned from this platform, which is currently struggling itself? But what lessons can you take from that as we look forward to figure out a better way or a different way, whatever your perspective, to build some collaboration to make this architecture more secure in the future?
Thank you. So, 2 questions, and I think, Julia, maybe we'll start with you on the Transnistria question. Is it a point of potential escalation in the war against Ukraine? What is your response to that scenario there proposed?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It's indeed, it was obscure until it wasn't. And I will never forget the day, it was a Saturday morning, I was walking my dog here in Washington, D.C., and the Washington Post was on the ground in the morning, and I saw Moldova on the front page for the first time in the history of Moldova. And I'm hoping the last time in terms of the turmoil, because it was connected to Transnistria, if you recall, some explosions, false flag in the first year of the war. And ever since, we've learned about Transnistria here in Washington, D.C. And the situation I would assess as the following. Indeed, that border is extremely long, and it bogs down Ukrainian military that would do much better being on the front lines, but it has to block Transnistria. And on the other hand, you have Moldova that has virtually no military. So for Ukraine to have a cooperation with the Moldovan military is not really tempting, because it's like 30 years of experience versus nothing, the equivalent. And of course, Moldova that is politically extremely vulnerable, with a president that I'm a big fan of in her work, in her administration, that has been forced to be extremely cautious in every single move, because she herself has been facing, due to Russian aggression, attempts for a coup. And so she has to calculate every single move, and is politically in a frail situation, depending security-wise on both Ukraine and Romania, including with training, etc. For over the last few months, for the first time, we've seen a cooperation between Moldova and Ukraine at border checks, which is sort of, I think, the prerequisite to what you might be looking at. And that comes after a frail situation in which, prior to 2014, Ukraine was actually in the negotiation format, which we call 5+2 for Transnistria, where Russia is a worrying party, but also a negotiating party, as we tend to have these formats around the Black Sea, and where Ukraine was doing Russia's bidding until 2014. After 2014, the border was somewhat closed because of what was happening in Ukraine, but a lot of the sustainability of Transnistrian economy is based, and the oligarchs that are running and formerly Transnistria are based on their Ukrainian citizenship and their ties to Odessa, as well as to now massive exports to the European Union. So experts, and I would agree with that, have assessed that the capacity for Transnistria to explode and for Russia to build a bridge from there towards Odessa is limited. But you're right that the risk of Odessa eventually falling through Mykolaiv, if the front lines are falling, then that would turn all the way to Transnistria and would be a real step towards Russia's Novorossiya project. But with again, I'm going back to my initial point that because Moldova's military is nothing really tempting for Ukraine's military cooperation, and because Moldova is forced to calculate every inch that it is moving 5 times because of the capacity of explosion in Chisinau, I would say that the project of military cooperation between the two and just taking over Transnistria is far from being concrete. It could happen, but I don't see any political or military incentives towards that in the coming months. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. And I'll turn to the last question now, if I may, on the role of the OSCE. We could also include perhaps the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, and what happened to them? Why have they sort of disappeared off the map and had no impact on Black Sea security, although they represent all Black Sea states? Michael, why don't you start on that one?
Sure. If I could very briefly say something on Transnistria, I just want to co-sign everything that Yulia just said. I also want to make it very clear that I think from our view, it's that is not a near or even medium-term prospect for some kind of a joint operation to retake Transnistria. The underlying fundamentals of the relationship between Tiraspol and Chisinau are quite positive, and I think there's genuinely a sense that reintegration is possible, and that there would be no reason to kind of upset that dynamic with a military attack. Now, it is possible that if Ukraine does experience severe military setbacks, maybe the Ukrainian military force itself might consider that possibility. But I think we're still very far from that being any kind of a near-term consideration. On the OSCE, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And Maggie, thank you for asking that question, because as someone from the Helsinki Commission, we are also children of the Helsinki Final Act. And so our goal, just as the OSCE's goal, is to uphold the Helsinki principles. And the idea of the Helsinki principles as being this normative framework that governs security and a holistic view of security in Europe and Eurasia. And I think a couple things. One, that Ukraine and this Russian war against Ukraine represents the most extreme test of those principles that we've ever seen in the lifetime of the Helsinki Final Act since it was adopted in 1975. But also it reveals, unfortunately, the fragility of that spirit of cooperation, the fragility of the structures that underlie the OSCE itself. And I don't think this is a knock on the OSCE, because I think we have to appreciate it was a platform for collaboration. It was a platform for dialogue. It was a platform for reimagining security in Europe in the middle of the Cold War. And in many ways, it succeeded. It didn't just succeed in providing kind of a means of stability for Europe, but it also succeeded arguably in being a precursor event to the end of the Cold War. And I think we neglect that aspect to our detriment. But looking at the institution now, something that I think is a challenge for all of us working in this space is the role that Russia has been able to carve out for itself as being something of like a, Schrodinger's stakeholder in terms of these various multilateral fora, including the OSCE, where it positions itself as both an invariable and an important stakeholder in the security architecture, but also is the most regular and aggressive violator of the security norms with which and by which that platform is meant to secure. So it becomes very hard in a consensus organization to repudiate Russia when we require their assent in most any type of business that goes on in an organization of that type. So that really requires, I think, a rethink just in terms of Russia and its role and the idea of it being a consensus organization. I think that's something that the organization is grappling with right now. And we at the Commission are very, very keyed into that discussion in a large way. But I do subscribe to the view that if we didn't have the OSCE, we'd probably have to create something else like it. And so, we don't want to have to go through all that again. So it's at the very least, we have this forum that is there. And I don't want to say that things haven't been done through the OSCE, because I think, yes, we've had to be creative, but the OSCE has managed to do extra budgetary projects. It's managed to do things outside of the consensus realms of the OSCE, to be able to get things done, to set up offices in Ukraine, to do these wonderful field missions throughout the Eurasian space that are very important and have been, I think, really key to ensuring like some baseline of stability and observability in the region. And I think that's been very important. It's maybe a bit underappreciated, but it has been something that we can go to. We can say, this is what our partners see. This is what is seen on the ground. And I think that's an underrated aspect of this cooperative endeavor.
Thanks, Michael. How many members now of the OSCE? Huh?
Yeah.
57. So yeah, that's hard to get consensus from 57 states.
Kidding.
I want to hand over to Asli, who to think about Turkey's role, perhaps in some of those regional organizations and how it views them. But and also a last word for you too, if you want to summarize your thoughts about what's been said.
Well, it's clear that post Cold War institutions are no longer delivering the needs of regional and international stability. OSCE is just one example. There are others. We're having a major crisis and at times crisis of legitimacy with international institutions and multilateral institutions. We are accustomed to thinking of European security with Russia. If post-Ukraine, we're going to have to start thinking of it without Russia, what is the framework for that? How do we address strategic stability? Can we actually address strategic stability without talking to Russians? And so on and so forth. So there's many issues here, only questions so far, no answers, but it's clear that new institutions would have to be invented.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much to the panelists.